Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Mad in America event on neuroplasticity, a path for healing from protracted withdrawal symptoms. We're so happy to have you here. And we are just going to give a minute for everybody to join. And if you want to go ahead and put your location in the chat box if you'd like, and maybe why you're joining, we'd love to hear from you. This is a topic that I'm really excited about, and I'm so excited to have everyone here. I think people are still joining, but we're a couple minutes into it. So I think, Bob, go ahead and why don't you take it away?
Well, first of all, everyone, thanks so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to have this panel. Real quickly, it's your donations. We're a nonprofit, so the little bit of donations from you all today is really helpful to us. It helps us bring these events to us. I should note that if you're a subscriber to Mad in America, which costs $20 for an annual subscription, you can come to all these events for free. But I just want to thank everyone for coming and helping make this possible. I'm really excited about this topic today. I'm going to learn a lot today, I hope. I'm sure I will. But the biggest thing for me is that there is a message of hope here. And, we hear so often of the difficulties of people for long periods of time after they've stopped taking psychiatric medications, and they can lead to some pretty dark spaces. So today, hopefully, we're going to tell a story which provides some hope about how to escape those dark spaces. We have three great panelists today. I couldn't be happier with the panelists. By the way, it was Karina who put together this wonderful panel, and so thank you, Karina. First, Ben Ahrens. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Ben. Ben, he was a semi-professional surfer when, at age 25, he was struck with chronic neurological Lyme disease, and he ended up bedridden for an extended period of time. And then he eventually used neuroplasticity concepts to recover from that disease and from protracted benzodiazepine and antidepressant withdrawal syndromes. He is the creator and CEO of reorganize, which is a neuroplasticity training program for people who suffer from chronic conditions, which of course includes protracted withdrawal syndromes. By the way, I'm going to switch to calling him a drug dysregulation syndrome, because one of the problems with the term drug protracted withdrawal syndrome, it makes it seem it's still related to withdrawing from the drug. And what clearly is with these protracted syndromes, there's some sort of injury, nervous system injury that has occurred. Kay Loveland is a clinical psychologist. She had personal experience with psychiatric drug withdrawal syndromes. And it wasn't until she adopted this approach that we will be talking about today that she recovered her health. She has a private practice in North Carolina and specializes in working with people with chronic illness, antidepressant and benzodiazepine withdrawal and protracted withdrawal syndromes, and PTSD. She also teaches other professionals in this concept. Gustav is a former psychiatrized person who resolved 5 years of suffering from drug dysregulation syndromes. Through a mind-body approach, he came to see protracted withdrawal syndromes as a learned brain state, e.g., there are neural pathways that are producing the syndromes. And the challenge is to unlearn the old and adopt the new. He has a YouTube video you can watch where he discusses his personal journey with this approach. So each of these three panelists will talk for about 13 minutes each, telling their story and also helping to illuminate what we're talking about here when we talk about neuroplasticity and how we can use this brain capacity to change to its environment to hopefully go on a path of recovery. Then we're going to have a period of time of where the panels will discuss and ask each other questions. One of the things that I really like about this subject is somewhat new to me. And so I'm really eager to hear how each of them asks questions to each other to sort of elucidate and illuminate this topic. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience. Zoe Kunif, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. Zoe's been writing for us for the last couple of months. She's done some great reports on mental health questions in college settings among mental youth. She's going to be moderating the chat room, so she'll be there. And Karina will be handling the question and answer. She's going to be feeding me questions when it's in the question and answer period.
There we go.
Again, thanks everyone for coming. Really excited about this. So, Ben, why don't you get started?
Yeah, sounds good. First of all, thanks, Bob and Karina, for setting this up. It's always at moments like this, I really love the internet. It's amazing to see so many people and coming from all different places, New Brunswick, Oslo, yeah, places I've been and that I love. So really nice to, yeah, have such a great community and base of support for people that have experienced the things we're going to talk about here. So I will just give a little bit of background on myself first and then get into my healing and recovery journey. But I will say that I was always been really fascinated and just interested with the human body, the human being, and how we can adapt and change from a really young age. I liked learning funny skills and things like juggling and just, being able to train my body to do interesting things. In my late teens, early 20s, I started getting into exercise physiology and studied mechanical engineering, exercise science, and philosophy. So sort of an odd combination. But I was very much into, the machinery of the body, and made that my career working in a surf camp, doing personal training and corrective exercise, and also was a traveling athlete and surfer myself. And in my mid 20s, I came up against a challenge that kind of forced me to really broaden or widen my scope of understanding of the human being when I came down with the severe case of chronic neurologic Lyme disease. Now, it seemed to come on fairly quickly after a intense season of operating a water sports camp on the east end of Long Island, where I was then going directly to travel. I went to Senegal, West Africa, competed in a surf competition, and it was like 72 hours of travel and very little sleep and a lot of stress. And I found myself waking up in bed with shakes and shivers and seeing spots and all these strange symptoms. And little did I know this was really the beginning of a journey that would land me bedbound for 3 years and take me down this wormhole of going to all these different types of doctors' visits, getting all sorts of different diagnoses, everything from MS to Lyme disease to POTS, anxiety, depression, you name it, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, all of these types of strange syndromes for which there um, isn't really a cohesive explanation. Um, that really led me to look at more of the sort of other side of the person, what I now see as sort of the software. So up until that point, I'd been really, interested and into understanding the hardware, the mechanics of the person. But what was so surprising even to me was that ostensibly from the outside, everything I had done should have kept me healthy, from a mechanics standpoint. And the idea that this little infection, this little tick could come down and, take me down was something really challenging to understand. And I remember there was a talk that I heard from Dr. Rao at the Marion Institute in, I think it's Massachusetts. And he said that if you start pulling people off the streets, in certain parts of the Northeast, from anywhere from 40 to as high as 90% of people would probably test positive for Borrelia, which is the Lyme-causing bacteria. But he said far fewer than 2% of those would actually exhibit Lyme disease, what he called when it's a full-blown expression of the symptoms. And I thought that was really interesting because the point he was making is that it's not just what's coming at us from the environment, but it's also how and why our body responds. And therein lies the sort of X factor when it comes to um, a whole host of things, how apt we are to get ill or fall ill, and how likely we are to recover. And as I started to go down this rabbit hole, I started getting into some research that dates back to the 1970s, things like conditioned immune suppression. When they started looking at what at the time was called the PNI system, or psychoneuroimmunology, basically how stress and how cumulative stress loads can affect the nervous system. And essentially, the takeaway is that again, it's not just what's coming at us from the environment, but it's how and why our body responds. And a big factor has to do with how much cumulative stress, what's called the allostatic stress load, we're carrying around with us. And unbeknownst to me, from childhood to a whole array of situations to just how I kind of interface with the world in ways I wasn't even really aware of, I had mounting levels of stress. And very poor sleep, even from childhood. I had insomnia my whole life, and so I would constantly sort of throw myself into these challenging scenarios like surf camp, like surfing, like traveling and competing, and always constantly sort of taking on more. Sometimes, in a large way out of interest, but also coming from a place of feeling the need to kind of prove myself, even to myself. Um, Regardless, I was unbeknownst to me, I was kind of carrying this like heavy, heavy load, such that it wasn't even surprising in retrospect that this little infection could come along and create such a catastrophe in my system. So throughout that process, and because insomnia was such a huge issue for me, one of the things that I tried very early on, even leading up to or before getting sick, was clonazepam. So that was, you know, uh, basically Clonopin. I had been on for about a decade already. And that was at first kind of like the only way I could get to, get any sleep. We now know that, clonazepam, one of the ways it works is it's really a muscle relaxant. So it's given to people for seizures and things like that. And I had this very high level of vigilance that my body was then kind of turning into this, converting to this heightened immune response. And anyway, going down this rabbit hole of seeing all these different doctors, at first I was put on antibiotics that turned into intravenous antibiotics. And for about 3 years, I was kind of going back and forth between antibiotics and then trying to treat the fallout that occurred from high doses of antibiotics, so things like candida, and basically going back and forth. In the end, after about 2 or 3 years of this, I had lost about 40 to 60 pounds of lean body mass. I had a catheter, semi-permanent catheter, stitched into my upper arm and inserted into my heart, delivering bouts of Rocephin twice a day. I was tethered to an oxygen tank, and I couldn't even walk. I couldn't even read, actually. My cognitive load and brain fog levels were so high that I was, for all intents and purposes, in a sort of vegetative state. And all the while getting further and further disconnected from my body because my body was such an uncomfortable place for me to live. It was all of these, fibromyalgia and dysregulation symptoms. Um, okay, so how did I begin to get out of this? I gave a TED talk on this around 2015. You can still see online, but I call it some like innate intelligence in me when I was for years in this state of just fighting and resisting and building up even more tension around the discomfort I was experiencing. Some part of me that knew a little bit better caused me at one point to take this really deep breath and let it out like with a big sigh. And for the first time in maybe a decade or maybe my whole life, on the other side of that deep breath, I found this little pocket of space, this little pocket of expansion where I could actually be at ease. I could actually experience like a little moment of peace. And it was completely fleeting. It lasted maybe like a tenth of a second, then it was gone. But what remained was this sense that there was the possibility to experience that again. And so I started making that a practice and putting it together in this sort of, ad hoc way where um, I had learned about things like neuro-linguistic programming and some basic tenets of brain retraining, which a lot of it maps onto much of what I had learned in physical training about things like conditioning. But essentially, the concept is number one, there are three kind of what I'll call universal principles of brain retraining. I'll just describe what those are. Number one, we want to have some awareness of a state that our body is in, a pattern. And it could be a tension pattern where we're just sort of, overly gripping or resisting our own discomfort, which is very common. So number one is just developing an awareness of that and having some way to interrupt it. In my initial way, it was that one deep breath, sometimes tensing up a little bit deeper and then relaxing. What I now know is something called progressive muscle relaxation. Number two is once we've identified that and interrupted the resistance pattern, we now want to replace it with a new pattern. So something that's like a relaxation response, right? And that can be some deep breathing, that can be giving yourself a hug, giving your body and your nervous system this sort of felt sense of safety that it may be lacking. Um, and then number three, we want to kind of solidify this with something called the science of small wins. Essentially, we want to consciously reward ourselves just for having broken the pattern, knowing that every time we go through that little cycle, it's like doing a repetition of an exercise where we've laid down a different path. The old neural pathway that was conditioned is saying, okay, we're going to continue to go down this path of tension, right? And here's where the what I was saying earlier kind of will fit in. The more and the deeper we go down the path of tension, the higher we build up this so-called allostatic load, that total level of stress that can accumulate in the nervous system over a lifetime. And the more that load builds up, the more reactive our system becomes. So the more reactive we become to pathogens, to viruses, to parasites, to things in the environment, including things like light and sound, foods and chemicals. In my case, I was developing all of these different sensitivities. And again, all the while, things like clonazepam were kind of this external tool that I was using at the time to try and regulate the system or calm these over vigilant responses from the outside in, because I didn't at the time have the tools or the ability to learn to regulate the system from the inside out. That's something I was starting to develop. So little by little, I started, developing these tools and going through these patterns and accumulating different somatic exercises and techniques to start to bring down that allostatic stress load. And I slowly, over the course of years, began feeling less sensitive and less reactive to things. And in doing that, my body was slowly and finally able to come to a place where its innate resources were available to heal. So I won't go into the full details. There's a lot you can see on my TED Talk and other videos out there. But suffice it to say, after a few years, I did make a complete recovery. The last remaining thing, however, was the use of clonazepam, and the sleep was still a major issue. And I tried for about 4, 5, 6 different attempts to diligently taper down. I sometimes tried to go cold turkey. And everything that I had been told, everything that I had been taught said that, these drugs, just like any chemical like caffeine, they have a certain half-life of 6 to 12 or 24 hours in some cases. And if you taper off, after and you completely work your way off, after 3 days, it will be out of your system and you'll be off of it. And whenever I got to that point, what I noticed was that I'd round that 3-day mark and my symptoms of vigilance and insomnia, and even some of those physical symptoms, would reemerge and get worse in day 3, in day 4, in day 5. By day 6, I wouldn't be able to leave my home. It was so virulent. The anxiety levels were so high. The stress level, the tension in my system was so strong. And I said, wait a minute, if I'm at day 6 or 7 now, and this is supposed to be out of my system, why are these symptoms getting worse? And therein, my mind went back to these conditioned, learned responses that I'll let Gustav share more about. But suffice it to say, I started essentially using the same techniques of brain retraining, of identification, interruption, and replacement of my own responses that had worked so well for the Lyme and hypersensitivity type of symptoms that I had felt. And again, very slow process, but over time, I was able to wean off in a way that was really sustainable. And I'm happy to share more about that, but I want to be mindful of the time and the other speakers here. So it's been quite an adventure. But all that to say is that it is possible. It requires sort of resetting your baseline. And all of this has just made me even more fascinated by what the human body, the human brain, and the human being is capable of. I think it really is limitless, our potential to heal and change. And for anyone who's listening who feels stuck, I know what that's like. I was there for many, many years. I just want to let you guys know that everything that I've learned and continue to learn about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change and adapt says that we're actually not stuck. We might be going in circles, we might be going in loops. That's likely for a time being, but we can actually shift those vicious cycles into virtuous circles that can really propel us back to health.
Ben, that was fantastic. What a great way to introduce this topic and this subject, and possibilities that do give people reason to hope. And it's part of what we, I think, sometimes talk about as maybe learned resilience is a little bit what's going on as well. I mean, learning how to be more resilient and change things. Anyway, that was fantastic. Next, Kay is going to speak for about 13, 15 minutes, and then Gustav will be up. So Kay, going to come on, start your video, and you're up.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad I could get on my phone to do this since my internet stopped working, but I decided to take a deep breath, like Ben said, and see if I can get back to my normal state of functioning. So this is really the first time that I have looked back on the past 5 years in chronological order about my withdrawal and protracted withdrawal from both an antidepressant and a benzodiazepine. And this journey was arduous, isolating, frightening, and sometimes it just seemed hopeless. But with time and perspective, it also has been enlightening, growthful, humbling, and connecting. But boy, this perspective took a lot of work and a lot of time. You might think, since I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm 72 years old, I've lived some years, that I would be well equipped to handle this kind of journey. Not only am I a clinical psychologist, but I also am a resiliency trainer. And I started camps for veterans with severe PTSD and their service dogs, helping them learn how to reset their limbic system to deal with flashbacks, post-traumatic stress injury, and all sorts of difficulties. And that's one of the most meaningful things I've done in my life. So I did that. And then I took what I had done, the program, and I used my own therapy dogs and went to the prison system and did the same kind of resiliency training there. But guess what? My past experiences and training were not all that helpful for me in dealing with all the withdrawal and the protracted withdrawal. And I've had a time to figure out why. And I think part of it is because I was under so much stress and a fair amount of pain. And I think my whole body and my whole system started being governed by what we call the sympathetic nervous system. That is the system in your body, and the limbic system that is the fight, flight, or freeze system. And with enough stress, enough chronic pain, it can start to become very active. And I don't know how many of you know about the hand model of the brain, but if this is your brain, you open it up and see where my thumb is? We could say that that's the amygdala, and that these fingers are the cortex and neocortex of your brain. And the amygdala is that little watchdog of our brain that goes, danger, danger, danger. And when it senses danger, it sends out all sorts of things to our body, like cortisol and epinephrine, to get us ready to fight the danger or flee the danger or even freeze. And this thinking part of our brain, the cortex and neocortex, can kind of go offline. It doesn't respond as quickly, and we can be governed by this part of our brain because our body is geared to survival. We want to protect ourselves. Well, over time, if that system, that limbic system, is basically in the sympathetic mode, it can get used to that, and it can start functioning that way. And your body, that's the default. And the amygdala can start seeing danger when there isn't even any danger. Well, I think I pretty much got into that state where I was functioning in that way most of the time. I was scared. I was having horrible symptoms. I was having a lot of pain. The other reason I'm glad to be here is I got a lot of help from other people. I got help online from Benzo Buddies and Cymbalta Hurts Worse. I learned how, for me, to properly withdraw from this medication, and that took a lot of learning. I'm not here to tell you that I'm right or I know exactly what to do for you, But if something that I have done can help you with your experience, can help you heal or get your body in a place to heal, then I really want to do that because I've been helped and I want to do this. So I'm going to share a little bit about my experience. I could write a couple of books about it, but I'm just going to share a little bit. And then I'm going to share what I've found helpful over the past years. In 1990, I was first diagnosed with Lyme's disease, but over lots of Rocephin treatment and everything, they finally diagnosed me with multiple sclerosis. And with the multiple sclerosis, I had severe migraine headaches almost every day. I finally went to a headache clinic and they tried nerve blocks. They tried all sorts of stuff. Finally, they said, hey, we've got a new medication called, get it, Cymbalta, and it may well help this, and we're using it off label. I was desperate, and so I said yes, and so I went on Cymbalta. I had to titrate up. I had some stomach problems, but it helped the headaches. And believe it or not, they told me that I could stay on it for the rest of my life and not have any problems. Well, I stayed on it for 20 years. Not a great idea. I didn't think about it. Nobody said anything about it until about 20 years later, I started getting kidney stones and a lot of gastrointestinal problems, and basically was told I needed to come off of it and that I should cut it in half and then I could just go off of it. Well, we all now know that's not a real good idea. But I cut it in half and did okay for a couple of weeks and then went down a little more. Everything started then, crying, head zaps, nausea. I just figured it would go away after a while, but it didn't. I kept getting worse. I had to stop seeing my clients. I was basically non-functional. You know, I had dealt with a lot of difficult things in my life, the loss of my parents, the loss of my husband, the diagnosis with MS. I wasn't prepared for what happened. I've never been so non-functional in my life, so upset, so much crying. My friends didn't know what was going on with me. I fortunately had a partner who was very kind and understanding, but it was very worrisome to him to see me that way too. After a couple of months, I sought out a psychiatrist who seemed very kind. And she upped the Cymbalta and started me on benzos. And I fought against it. I thought, no, this isn't a good idea. But she reassured me that since I really didn't have an addictive personality, that I wouldn't have any trouble getting off of it. So I went on the benzos, they upped the Cymbalta, and things got worse and worse. And finally she said, Kay, you know, you're falling, you're not in good health. I don't know enough about withdrawal. I think you need to go to an inpatient facility, a psych facility, where they can really know about withdrawal and can help you. Whew. Well, everything in me said, no, I shouldn't do that, except for my desperation. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't getting better. I was scared to death. Desperation won out. Bad decision. Understatement. I'm going to tell you a bit about it just to caution you against doing what I did, to really research things. Most inpatient psych facilities are not trained and do not know how to appropriately withdraw someone from a medication. They don't understand protracted withdrawal injury, and they're apt to look at you as a psychiatric patient or a drug abuser. So I got there. My partner took me, Patrick took me in a wheelchair. They wouldn't let him come inside. They got me inside. They took away all my belongings, my book, even my CPAP, rolled me to a room where I sat and sat. And the next day, a psychiatrist came in and questioned me from the door for about 10 minutes. I told her that I'd had no history of anxiety or depression, that I was withdrawing from Cymbalta. Now, I think she rolled her eyes. I can't promise you that, but it looked to me like she was rolling her eyes as if like, sure you do. The next day, she started me on an additional antidepressant, Celexa, halved the benzos, and you can imagine what that must have done. I was just not even functioning. But I did say to her, I know there's another psychiatrist on staff. This does not seem like a good withdrawal kind of thing for me. Could I please speak to the other psychiatrist? Well, I was told that that was inappropriate behavior on my part, that by asking to do that, I was triangulating the staff, and I must have some kind of personality disorder to do that, and we'd have to take a look at that. Well, my thinking part of my brain finally came in, to sight, and I knew that this was not a good place for me. So I asked for a discharge. Patrick came and picked me up, and I left wiser but more traumatized on more medication. Found another psychiatrist. I'd heard of him. He was very good. I went and talked with him. He's very well known in the community. He said the way to get off of my Cymbalta was to get on Lexapro and benzos, and then we could get, while I was still on the Cymbalta, I could be on all three, and then we'd get off of the Cymbalta and then off the Lexapro. And I said, wait a minute, are you sure? This doesn't sound like a very good idea. And he said, yeah, I've done this many, many times. Well, to make a long story short, within 2 days, my blood pressure was 180 over 120, went to urgent care. I had serotonin syndrome, ended up in the hospital. They said that I could easily have a stroke, that I was on too much serotonin medicine. So I had to cut the Cymbalta in half, which you can imagine was not great for my limbic system or for me. I ended up in a lot of trouble. All right, so I started researching on the internet, and I came across a wonderful place out in Arizona that said they knew exactly what to do for withdrawal, and they had saunas and yoga and all sorts of wonderful things. And so I took a lot of my life savings and went out there. My partner took me out there. It looked like a pretty place, looked like nice people. It did not really help. There were lots of supplements, which really weren't very helpful. There was not that much information about how supplements can affect withdrawal. They gave me some intravenous stuff that was really not helpful at all. And there was some pretty strange stuff going along. Most of the patients were there for addiction or very severe psychiatric problems. So after 2 months, I left there a lot poorer, but not better. So I finally found a really good psychiatrist that listened to what I had to say about slow titration of less than 10% every couple of weeks. And she wanted to learn, and she worked with me as a team. So that's the first thing I recommend is you have to have knowledge about what proper titration is for you getting off this medication. And then you have to have a team to work with you. So I managed to get off over the next couple of years in a very slow, really slow way. First one medication, then the other. And I was doing great. I was playing tennis again. I was seeing my clients again. I was so happy. 6 months later, protracted withdrawal hit. No appetite, constant myoclonic jerking of my body all day, 2 hours of sleep, severe tinnitus, severe histamine reaction to food, a lot of gastrointestinal problems. And this was all made worse because I had emergency gallbladder surgery. So you can imagine the stress on my body and how I was not really able to heal. The interstitial cystitis I had flared, and I was in constant pain. I could go on with what people tried to prescribe in terms of supplements and tried to get me to reinstate a small amount of Lexapro and a small amount of Valium. Finally, I decided, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to have to figure out what to do for myself. I'm going to have to get the right kind of help. I figured out what was going on, had to be that my limbic system was on high and that I had to get my sympathetic nervous system to calm down, my parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest, to take over. And I was going to do that by getting my body in as calm a state as I could, as long as I could. And it was going to take a lot of work on my part, but that I could do it and I was going to do it. Let me tell you what helped. Number one, my dogs helped. I have the most wonderful dogs, and I did what I did with the veterans. I would pet them, and I would concentrate on how I felt on the inside when I would pet them, and I would savor that calmness and let it go on for as long as I could to get, because, when you pet a dog, you get a lot of oxytocin, and that's a calming, peaceful hormone. So I did a lot of petting of my sweet dogs. I did acupuncture, which did help. I did massage. I used my Muse headband for meditation, and I did that twice a day. My sweet partner rubbed my feet and my back every day, and I really paid attention to all the positive sensations in my body. And then I found a program. I knew I needed help, so I looked at the Gupta program, I looked at a program that involved music, and I looked at Reorigin. I loved Reorigin. And And that's the one I went with. And the reason I loved it was because it presented the information in small bits, which is what I could handle at the time. It had several techniques that you could choose from. You didn't have to do just one thing. You could see what worked for you. And I really joined a momentum group, which was a small group of people that met together with a coach. And it was extremely helpful because we celebrated our wins together. Okay, very specifically, I'm going to talk about what I did with Reorigin. There's something called the long form, which is it's a whole way of dealing with your limbic system. You might think about what a looping thought is. You kind of imagine what that might be visualized as. You push it literally away from you. You shrink it. You throw it away. But you also talk to your limbic system. You say, hey, limbic system, I know you're trying to protect me. But I've got this now. And then you do some calming and some breathing. But then the most important part is you do a visualization. And I did this several times a day. It could be any kind of visualization that helps you calm. I would visualize sunsets, or I'd even go out and look at a sunset. And I'd breathe. And I would think of all the colors. And I would just let my body relax as much as possible. I did that every day, several times a day, because what eventually happened is I started resetting my limbic system so I could do what was called a short form. And the short form, I did that several times today, just preparing for talking to you guys, because I was a little nervous about it. The short form was that I could imagine in my brain the looping thought, like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this panel. What if it doesn't go well? I hope what I have to say helps people. And I go, pause. And then I just imagine it looking at as like an image. I'd shrink it, distance it, and I'd throw it away, and I'd feel better. And I do that when I have little memories of symptoms that come up. I may do this 10 times a day. My bladder starts to hurt, or I start to feel a little anxious about a symptom coming back. I will do a short form. The other thing that Reorigin helped me with, I didn't mention, I used to play a lot of tennis. I played in college. I played a little on the circuit. I was a sports psychologist for a while for a number of professional athletes, including tennis players. So I miss tennis like crazy. So one of the things that the Reorigin program does is doing things in small incremental steps. And so I decided to do that. I was bedbound, but I first imagined playing tennis in my brain. And I went ahead and I said, okay, I'm playing at Wimbledon. And so I imagined I was playing tennis at Wimbledon. And I'd serve and I'd hear the thwack of the ball and I'd imagine winning a point and then would savor all the sensations inside of that positive, playing tennis in my mind. Then I put a tennis racket in my kitchen. And every time I go to the kitchen, I'd hit the ball on the tennis racket up in the air or down on the ground. And then I do it with my left hand so I could get some bilateral stuff going. And then I went outside and I hit into a little rebound net. And then later I went to a tennis court and I started serving, just 5 minutes of serving. And then I went and hit it on the ball machine. And then eventually I went and there was a group of women I played with, and then they let me play just a game. I would substitute in for a game. And then I do 3 or 4 games. Then I played a couple of sets. I'm now playing tennis again, but I did it incrementally, small steps, and win. The other thing I'd do every night is I would sit out and look at our beautiful mountains, and I'd watch the sunset, and it was different every night. And I'd take pictures of it to look at later in the day, but I'd also sit and savor the peace and the colors and the beauty and the spiritual nature of just being in God's creation or nature. And it was so soothing to my soul. So as you can see, what I did was I tried to create a situation where my body was in that rest and relaxed state and let my body get used to that being the default state. It was like I was building new little pathways in my brain, that was going to be the default rather than the anxiety. Because I think I was dealing with both the stress of coming off of the medication and whatever was going on neurologically, but then it was exacerbated by my fear response and my hopelessness. So I figured if I could work on the hopelessness and the fear, that I could at least create a situation where healing is more possible. Now, I know that healing is different for every one of you. and that you have to find what works for you. Depends on what feels like a win for you. It feels like what you can do each day. And remember, for some days, I could only imagine playing tennis. I couldn't actually play tennis. So not everything is going to work for everybody. And I don't know if everybody could be healed totally. I still have some symptoms, but I'm so much better. And so what I want to say to you guys out there is that there's hope. Okay. Get a team. But by the way, my doctor kept telling me I might have a mood disorder until I bought the Maudsley deprescribing manual and went in and read him several portions to him about protracted withdrawal. And he finally looked at me. He said, you know what? I've learned something. You're right. So you have to kind of speak some of the physician's language. But I've been lucky enough to have both a psychiatrist and a physician who listened and were willing to learn. But sometimes I had to kind of do it in a way that might speak to them. So to finish off, I just want to wish each and every one of you healing. I appreciate every single one of you being here. If there's any people that are health partners or doctors or psychologists or psychiatrists, thank you so much for coming, because we all need people that are informed and understand this and can help everybody be a team member and help people get better. I wish you all the best. I really do. I hope that everybody can learn something from today and continue with their journey. Thanks.
Thank you, Kay. That was inspiring. It's always amazing to hear how difficult some of the what we call protracted withdrawal syndrome or drug dysregulation syndrome, just the extent of the pain and suffering that comes with that, and emotional, physical. And so it is nice to hear stories of that hope that there can be a way out of that very difficult time. Gustav's going to speak next, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So Gustav, come on.
Yeah, so hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And for my story, I'll get into how I resolved about 5 years of protracted withdrawal sensations and chronic pain using a mind-body approach. And this approach was inspired by the late pain physician, John Sarno, and also kind of more recent developments on his ideas as well, so I'll get into. But I just kind of note off the top, that even though I'm not the first person that's actually resolved protracted withdrawal sensations this way, I'm always really hesitant to share my story because I never want to make it sound like I'm making definitive statements, about protracted withdrawal. So I just kind of remind you that this is kind of my own story and the ideas that worked for me. And, if it resonates with someone else to pick up on, that's great. And, if not, that's perfectly fine too. And I'd also just say that I'm just kind of scratching the surface here in a way. So I do have a YouTube video and a resource page that you can look at if you're inclined to do that. And I guess we'll talk a bit more afterwards too. So with that being said, I could start by giving a bit of background information. I was psychiatrized for about 5 years. And during that time, I probably took about 20 drugs. More often than not, I was disabled during this period in my life. And I think, long story short, once I understood that psychiatric drugs can create imbalances as opposed to correcting them, I started to understand exactly why I felt as badly as I did. So naturally, I wanted out. I wanted my life back. And I was always told that I could stop taking psychiatric drugs in a matter of weeks. So that's what I did. Not surprisingly then, I developed acute withdrawal. But what did confuse me is that this withdrawal reaction appeared to just linger and linger on. And during this lingering period, I sprained my back. And though my back quickly healed, as my MRI showed, the back pain, it just kept going. And this confused me because I thought, why am I still feeling pain if I'm healed? And is it maybe somehow related to why I'm still feeling these withdrawal sensations? So I didn't know, but I got really stressed out, and basically all these sensations just overtook me, and I ended up taking psychiatric drugs again, this time with the goal to slowly taper off of them. And while this initially helped somewhat, a lot of these withdrawal sensations, they just kind of continued or they evolved, and just oftentimes they could just get really, really scary. So as time went on, this went on and on, I thought I had something called like protracted withdrawal syndrome, this sort of drug sickness model where protracted sensations are just like always due to a unique neurobiological injury, of a basically unknown nature. And all I could do was just kind of wait and, hopefully heal one day, And as a result of that, I kind of just lived in fear like 24/7. I just felt very helpless. I was terrified of the drugs, of my mind, of my body, of my emotions, just kind of everything. So I interpreted all this as just kind of like a symptom of withdrawal all the time. And so just deep down, I just got just so discouraged that I just never get better. And I believe something quite similar about the chronic pain I was experiencing as well. And so I just dealt with these withdrawal and pain sensations for about 5 years. And the really scary part is that in some ways I just kept getting worse. And I became more and more physically disabled, especially. And I really started to wonder, how much more of that I could really take. But finally, I reached a turning point when I discovered a Talks at Google presentation by Howard Schubiner, a physician who trained with John Sarno and kind of reformulates Sarno's ideas with some more recent pain research. So I just like to talk about pain for a minute because I think it's really relevant to my experience with withdrawal. So what's now found is that most chronic pain is non-structural. So there's no physical injury, there's no neurobiological disease. And that's not to suggest that, these painful sensations are like, all in the head or aren't real or something like that. They're very, very real. They just can be explained in a neuroplastic way. So for instance, if there's an injury, a danger alarm signal can go off in the brain and pathways can form to process the pain. And what can happen is even after an injury heals, these brain pathways processing the pain, they can just remain behind. And what seems to keep this processing going is if the brain's alarm system stays on, if some threat remains active. So if a person's really stressed out, like I was, this pain processing may go on and on until the brain can basically learn to produce the pain on its own. And I think that's why I still felt this pain, even after my back healed, because this brain processing, it just kept going. Now, back then, I didn't connect this idea, this brain learning concept to withdrawal sensations, that maybe my brain could actually learn to keep generating withdrawal-like sensations on its own, even if I wasn't in withdrawal anymore, or even if there wasn't a neurobiological injury anymore. But I would come to see it this way because I would resolve or kind of unlearn both pain and withdrawal at the same time using this understanding, which I'll get into. But I think to make that make more sense, I just want to first talk about two ways that I think explain why this danger signal kept going for myself and kind of cause these withdrawal and pain sensations to persist. So I think the first way this alarm kept going was my sense of physical danger. I mean, I was just totally preoccupied with these sensations because I thought, I was probably brain damaged. So these sensations were just like the first thing I thought about when I woke up in the morning, the last thing I thought about, when I went to bed. I would scan for them all the time. I would think about them all the time. I would research them, talk about them all the time. And I think all this fear sent a message to my mind that something, really important and scary was going on. And it kind of reinforced this danger alarm signal, I think, that was processing these sensations. And I think ultimately what happened is my stress response got wired together with these withdrawal sensations. So I'd have stress and then, I'd feel withdrawal or get in withdrawal. Then I'd get withdrawal or I'd just be automatically freaking out. It was kind of just like this vicious cycle. This went around and around. But at the same time, sometimes I'd get these like waves that would just come out of nowhere. And I thought, okay, well, how is this possible? So I think the second thing that kind of kept this danger signal going for myself was a sense of emotional danger that seemed to come from my own sort of deeper emotions. And there's now this fascinating sort of neuroscientific research that shows that as pain becomes chronic, the active areas of the brain, they shift away from like physical injury processing and toward like emotional processing. So in a way, persistent pain is actually kind of an emotional injury where it can become an emotional injury over time. And it's kind of shocking because beneath my conscious awareness of all these horrible, often very physical sensations, it was actually emotional activity that was keeping them going. And I think a big part of this was just my fear of my ongoing situation, but it does appear to be more than just that, because there's now this connection between mysterious syndromes that go on in trauma. And I think my own trauma, especially from childhood, kind of sensitized this danger alarm system to go off more easily. And when this alarm went off again in withdrawal, I think it kind of triggered old emotions about feeling unsafe in my life. And I think it's my history of feeling unsafe that helped keep this danger alarm system activated. And I also think, my immense fear and rage I had towards psychiatry, I think that also kind of contributed to this sense of emotional danger. And I don't think, this is some sort of like medicalizing concept like PTSD or anything like that. But John Sarno had a non-pathologizing concept that eventually got called the mind-body syndrome, or TMS, which basically just says that emotional stress can induce or maintain physical syndromes, which I think is now being shown in research. So I guess with that said, I can start to say a bit of how I actually resolved this mind-body syndrome for myself. So John Sarno talked about his mind-body approach as basically a form of knowledge therapy, because it's through self-education that I could learn to calm down this danger signal. And I could do this by understanding that, one, I'm not in any physical danger anymore, that I'm not damaged, that this is just a learned syndrome. And two, that I'm not in any emotional danger anymore, despite all that's happened in my life. So basically, I had to teach my mind that I'm now safe, to turn off this danger alarm mechanism. And, here's a few examples of how I did that. So for me to feel physically safe again, I had to let go of this idea of protracted withdrawal syndrome. And, that was not easy. It was a very, very strongly held identity, but it was just not serving me. It just made me scared all the time. I had no definitive proof I was even injured anymore. So I just kind of left this withdrawal world behind and immersed myself in this mind-body world. And from there, I started to change my relationship with the sensations that I felt. And this went from seeing them as like a scary symptom of withdrawal to like a learned brain pathway that only fired because I felt unsafe in some way. And I think this is where I could work on kind of reducing that emotional danger inside myself. And, one thing I did here, was sort of structured journaling, which is quite common in this approach. And I just kind of looked at, among other things, kind of the core issues in my life that made me feel unsafe and maintain this danger alarm. And it's kind of through journaling that I realized just how truly upset I was, and also just how important it was to acknowledge and validate my own feelings and kind of listen to this hurt child inside myself and begin to show myself some compassion. And then I could remind myself that all this stuff that's happened, this danger, it's now over, but it's still safe to have emotions about it. And I think this really helped to contribute to this reducing this emotional tension. Now, I could even practice this if I got sucked into like a wave, because I could ask, what's triggered this? What might be bothering me emotionally? And sometimes I would know, sometimes I wouldn't, but I could always remind my mind that this wave is just a learned response from stress or emotions or condition. Maybe it's a condition response. And I could switch my focus from this physical realm to looking at the psychological arena of my life. And I think that would be more direct in addressing, the wave's roots to eventually stop them from recurring. And finally, and I guess quickly, the final thing I did was I had to kind of act on this education. I had to get back to living my life and doing the things that I wanted to do. And that was so important because it reinforced this idea that I was healthy, as opposed to doing things that reinforced this idea that I was in withdrawal. And kind of by doing this emotional work and then getting back to my life, I stopped caring about these sensations so much. And eventually, this alarm system, it just shut off. And the pain went away, the withdrawal sensations went away, and that was it. And I haven't really had any, real trouble since then. And that was like 5 years ago. So yeah, that's how I did it. It was this process of understanding and seeing myself in a new light. And yeah, that's what helped get me through.
Thanks, Gustav. These were great presentations. I have like 500 questions, but I want to give a chance for the audience, the people here, to present their questions to you. So we talked about and if all the panelists can come back on so we can see everybody, that'd be great. We talked about the panelists asking each other questions, but I think because of the time we are at now, I'm going to just present some questions from the audience, okay? But that was really great. I do have one sort of thing right away, though, to ask is sometimes people will say, oh, your withdrawal syndromes, your symptoms are just all in your head. You sort of referred to this, Gustav. And that's a sign that they're not real. That's a sort of a way of discounting the symptoms you're feeling. How would you respond to that? Because in a way, we're talking about, neuroplasticity, which allows to set down new pathways, that sort of thing, to adapt to your environment. So how would you answer the criticism that some people get? Oh, these symptoms are all in your head. They're not, which makes it sound like they're not real.
Yeah.
So if Kate can come back on as well, anybody who wants to address that, and then I'll ask some questions from the audience.
Yes, I can say something. So personally, I know they're real because I experienced them. That's how I know they're real more than anything else. The pain was debilitating. I was like partly bedbound for like years, and the withdrawal sensations didn't just manifest as like sensations that I kind of talked about, but even like visibly, like I could see things on my body that weren't right. So it definitely wasn't all in my head. It wasn't in my head at all. They're very real. I just found, like, personally, what helped me was this idea that it's a learned response. So this processing is still going on in the brain. It's very real, but it's learning. It's just happening. It's recurring as a sort of conditioning, as opposed to it being, an actual reaction still from a drug. At least that's the way it manifested for myself. And other people could have different experiences.
That's a good answer. I just wanted to put that down, put that idea down, because I know that this is sometimes what people get accused of. Oh, you've been a psychiatric patient. It's all in your head. But I think that was a great way to explain it. I'm going to start with a question that was submitted prior to the event from someone in the audience. And that is this: is there a way to use neuroplasticity, some of what you're talking about, during the tapering process, presumably before the brain is more seriously challenged by withdrawal? I know one of the audience members we have here today is Peter Groot, who invented the tapering strips to help you go down very slowly. But can you see a way to use these ideas even before you're off the drugs, during the tapering process, to help yourself? Kay, you have.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Because for me, I see it in a kind of a different way. I think there is injury that happened. I think the GABA receptors get hyper. I think there's lots of things that happen to the body. And then additionally, I think the fear response, the anxiety, the way the brain gets trained, that also happens. So I think it's both. I think if you start doing some of these things during the withdrawal process, start doing some of the breathing, the meditation, the incremental successes, get connection. I think it can help a lot, and probably can help all that part where you've learned, the body learns to respond with stress and fear and anxiety, can help you not add on symptoms to what already might be happening. I think it's a fantastic idea. And I think people really ought to do that. I think it's a great concept.
Ben or Gustav, I think this is so many people in our audience are in the process of tapering. Thank you, Kay. That was great. Any additional thoughts to what Kay said? Because this is something so a common experience for so many in the audience. So, Ben.
Yeah, I agree with what Kay said. It's something that we can do to kind of come in for a softer landing. There's a lot that we can do to really help ourselves by really reducing that total stress load, that allostatic load I was talking about before. And for what to what Gustav said and explained so wonderfully about how our brain learns and we get these sort of conditioned responses, the brain really has two top priorities. And the first priority is survival. So it's always going to look out for us. And sometimes it's going to overestimate the sticks and underestimate the carrots. And oftentimes what it perceives as sticks in this case are unpleasant sensations, including physical sensations as well as mental and emotional feelings as well. So the number one priority for the brain is survival. The number two priority for the brain is efficiency. And part of what it does is it learns from the past to protect us in the future. And if we are going through a period where we have a lot of stress in our lives, and again, that can be due to the circumstances, to the environment, but that can also just be due to how our brain and body have processed our own past and history. But when we have this high load, it sends the brain further in that direction of survival. So the brain errs more on the side of caution. This is known as the negativity bias. And so much can be accomplished by simply starting to reduce that stress load and doing some of these types of breathing exercises, somatic exercises, things like that during or prior to starting to taper. It's sort of like adding cushioning, adding padding to your feet instead of trying to go out and pad the whole world. And then the second thing I'll say is I think the real promise and power of neuroplasticity is that it doesn't just allow us to kind of reset that baseline and reduce that total stress load. That alone would be great because it has a lot of global effects in the system. But the second thing is then we're in a much better place to when we do experience those symptoms, whether they're, in my case, it was a lot of things like chemical flu or just heightened pain sensitivity. When we do experience those symptoms, now we have these tools in our toolkit where we can actually help ourselves to not over respond to them. And I don't say it's not a conscious response. This is a very subconscious thing that's happening, the same way that your hands would go up to protect your face if a baseball flies out of the stadium, right? This is what's called a reflexive response. But once we become aware of these responses and we learn how to interrupt them, replace them with something more calming and soothing, then our brain learns to create a different association. The brain might see that ball coming toward you and say, oh, you know what? I don't need to necessarily tense my body and create this exaggerated response. I can simply take a step to the side and let it pass by. And the brain and body really perceives the symptoms in the same way that when we start to practice this, even prior to or during tapering, then if or when we experience those symptoms, we now have the ability to sort of like in the Matrix to opt out, to choose a different way rather than just pushing against them and sometimes driving ourselves deeper into that gritty, pain sensation. We can learn how to step aside, learn to be with them, to flow with them. And somewhat paradoxically, by doing that, the symptoms themselves usually start to lessen or to reduce. So yeah, just really great advice.
Yeah. And as well, I actually resolved these sensations for myself while I was still tapering, which might be important to note. It's kind of complicated tapering because sometimes, there's adverse effects from the drugs that are happening, and so it's kind of, well, is this a mind body phenomenon? Is it an adverse effect from the drug? And sometimes it was pretty obvious it was an adverse effect from the drug. And when I was tapering, sometimes I would taper too fast. When I taper too fast, it's obvious, okay, this is coming from the drug. But as over time went on and the drugs kind of doses got lower and the tapering went really, really slowly, and I still had all these sensations going on, then it started to make me wonder, okay, could there be anything else going on here? And that's when I kind of looked into this. I think one of the biggest things for me was this fear response to the tapering. So I was so scared of the drugs and so scared of tapering. And I think that played a significant role in kind of reinforcing this kind of danger signal to my mind and keeping it going. I also think I had expectations that I would keep going. And when I actually resolved these sensations in the end, while I was still tapering, it kind of confirmed to me that actually that was what was going on for myself. And so then when I finished the taper, I didn't have any withdrawal at all as I finished the taper and got off the drug. So that might be important to note.
We have so many great questions here. I wish we had hours for this. Those are great answers. Thank you. Really help explain things. Two questions hopefully we can get to, and then before we have to wrap this up. As you know, that many people suffer what is called post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And sometimes it's seen as different from protracted withdrawal syndromes. And there's a sense with PSSD, which doesn't resolve, that there's been sort of a lasting neurological injury of some sort. People, if you talk to people suffering from PSSD, they just can't get enthused. It's like they've lost their capacity to be, enthusiastic about a rainbow, about a partner, about sex. So it's not just sort of sexual dysfunction. It's like their ability to become aroused in a good way, emotionally aroused, emotionally responsive, has been permanently diminished, or at least it's diminished. So can you speak to whether, this neuroplasticity and what you're talking about, can it be a way to cope with PSSD and hopefully move beyond PSSD? Ben, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because one of the side effects or effects that happened when I was going through Lyme and my own protracted withdrawal and my brain and body were under heightened stress load was that my testosterone plummeted from 700 or 800, which is what it should be for a 20-something-year-old male, down to I think like the 84 or something. What my doctor quote said was that of a 12-year-old girl. So it didn't make me feel the best at the time. But effectively, we see this a lot when people come to the Reorigin program is they cannot touch base with their sense of enthusiasm. It feels like the lights aren't on. And part of the explanation for that, we think, is that the body is a very intricate system of resources and resource allocation. And when we are tuning into or feeling bombarded by discomfort, by pain, by unpleasant sensations and emotions, this kind of confirms back to the brain, rightfully or wrongfully, that we are in danger. And what we're talking about here, of course, is that these signals are often misguided. But whether real or perceived, when the brain perceives that we're in danger, it's going to prioritize survival type of responses, which are sympathetic, which are heightened stress responses, which involve things like cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, things that prepare us for action to make us more aware and vigilant. And this is actually why our senses increase, why we become increasingly sensitive to symptoms and sensations, to lights, sounds, foods, or chemicals. The same way that if you go into the forest and you're in a survival situation, your brain will ramp up your vision, your visual system, your hearing, and so forth. But nothing happens for free. Those resources that get amplified and allocated toward survival activity are taken away from or diverted away from the things that are the more long-term healing and procreation type of activity, like even formation of brain chemicals that would make us feel happy, the dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. All of the production of those types of chemicals and hormones and things like testosterone get deprioritized because your brain and body are like, well, you don't need to worry about procreation or being happy if it thinks that you're in survival mode. And so when people come to that experience and they think it's like a mental or psychological thing, it's actually very much a neurological thing. It's a resource allocation where temporarily it may be chemically impossible to feel excited. That's certainly how it was for me. But just again, offering a word of hope, the body does have this innate ability to find homeostasis, to rebalance itself. And when we start to shift the brain, teaching it that new message, right, shift out of survival mode, then the proper resource allocation will resume. And the brain and body will naturally start to replenish those feel-good hormones and chemicals and whatever is needed for long-term healing and procreation. All of those things do come back online. It just requires that we shift more and more out of survival. And as Kay so eloquently put it, I love it. Learn how to default to that parasympathetic rest and digest state.
Yeah, Kay. And then we'll got time for one more question. Kay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll do it quickly because I did this. This happened a lot with the veterans that I work with that couldn't feel pleasure for much of anything. So that's why we started out. That's why I'm showing my companion here. I got them just starting out simple stuff, petting their dog, and notice any positive sensations that came just from petting the dog and letting their oxytocin increase. And so we started with real small, simple, pleasurable things. I agree with everything Ben said. I think he said it very, very well. The body's trying to survive, and it's not in a place to do all the other things. But if we start with very non-threatening, if you got a dog or a stuffed animal or anything, just start with petting them and notice any positive sensations in your body, and you can go from there. But that's a good start.
I think everyone should have a dog or pet. Real quickly, here's a question from the chat room, and one of the things that Mad in America never wants to do is promote any sort of that this is the way.
No.
And we do think that there's idiosyncratic, individualized ways to recovery. But here's one that I think you all can address. Can you speak to when certain neuroplasticity programs may be inappropriate during psych med withdrawal injury? Conventional wisdom within the med harm community is that one should wait until they are not in the acute phase of withdrawal to start brain retraining programs, check for deficiencies, etc. So basically what they're asking, is there a risk associated with going into brain retraining programs at a certain time during the when you're struggling with withdrawal symptoms? Any sort of response to that worry or thought? Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I would say it really depends on the type of brain retraining program, and particularly the starting point. So one of the rationale reasons why you might see something like an increase in vigilance is that when you're starting a brain retraining program, a big part of it is just awareness. A big part of this learning journey is developing a certain awareness. And as I mentioned earlier, when the brain or body or mind has become an uncomfortable place to live, the survival response, the default, is that we tend to disconnect. We tend to break what's known or inhibit interoception, which is our ability to connect with and perceive our own body state. Because again, why would we want to perceive that if what we're perceiving is uncomfortable? And as we start to retrain the brain, part of that process starts with awareness. And so for the first time in maybe years or even decades in some cases, we might be actually just tuning into what's there and feeling more into the discomfort. And so, for that reason, I'll say we have had the benefit at the Reorigin program of working with some clinicians and experts that work in chronic pain and protracted drug withdrawal, and have done so for decades in the clinical setting, and it really helped us to create a program that starts with a sort of first phase that we call reset before it gets into the real rewiring. So it's sort of like gradually getting into the bathtub, so that in a comfortable, gentle way that keeps the system at ease, as opposed to just jumping in, full in. So I would actually, if someone feels very, hypersensitive and vigilant, I would advise against just jumping full in. But we've definitely taken that into account in our program by starting off with this sort of reset phase, which involves understanding, sort of gentle introduction to it, and gradual reconnection with your body and sensations, while at the same time learning how to self-regulate and how to come back into this, calmer parasympathetic state.
Great, thanks. I think we get sort of time for last thoughts from each of you. This has been a great, really interesting sort of part about the mystery of what it is to be alive and experience the world comes forth here. So why don't we go around the horn and just sort of last thoughts, and maybe start with you, Gustav, and then we'll go to Kay, then we'll go to Ben. So Gustav?
Yeah, sure. So I was watching some stuff previous to this panel, and I saw a Mad in America panel. I think that was like last year about success stories about like resolving withdrawal. And I think the moderator there asked, for like commonalities about their stories, and like one of the panelists said something that struck me because I thought the same thing, and that they kind of took like an active role in trying to like resolve the sensations for themselves. It even talked about, for them, letting go of the idea of withdrawal syndrome. And like for me, protracted withdrawal syndrome, and for me, like I had watched that back when I was still experiencing this, I would have been like, what is this? How could this possibly be? I have protracted withdrawal syndrome. There's nothing I can do, to do that. And, I was just so hopeless. And I think for me, kind of the biological determinism that's just kind of always seems to be placed on protracted withdrawal syndrome, I think was just a harmful idea for myself, that just believing always in this kind of biomedical model of it. And, it's not to say that people can't have like iatrogenic injuries, or stuff like that from these drugs. These drugs are obviously very powerful. But I hope if people take anything from today, at least from what I said, that there are, alternatives, to this model. And there's some growing evidence that at least some people can actually work to resolve these syndromes. And from that last panel I saw like last year, it seemed to be through like their kind of understanding and intuition that they kind of figured it out on their own. And for me, in like maybe the stuff we're doing today, we're talking a bit more about systems. But yeah, I just thought it was so impossible that I'd ever get out of these things. And like people still think it's impossible to get out of like chronic pain. Now there's clinical trials that came out a few years ago where it's not only possible, but it's likely for people to resolve pain of non-structural origin using specific mind-body approaches. And there's a study that came out called About Pain Reprocessing Therapy. So, I think sometimes it almost sounds too good to be true, but that's just because there's just so much negativity out there kind of all the time. And it can just kind of like weigh on you and think it's not even possible. So, the stuff I'm talking about today, like mind-body syndrome stuff, you can find a lot of stuff online for free. I have a resource page where people can go and check it out. I don't do this professionally at all, but I'm just here to just offer something that hopefully people can use. And I hope that ultimately people, do what's right for themselves, and follow their hearts, because that's the most important thing. And for myself, these ideas really changed my life, and it's the most transformative knowledge that I've received. But yeah, that's, I think, all I really have to say. So just thanks for having me again today.
Thanks, Gustav. Really appreciate those words. Kay?
Yes, I was thinking I spent some time being very angry at the doctors that I felt had let me down, and angry at myself for going against my better judgment on a number of occasions and assigning authority to them. What I've decided to think instead was that the people that I was with, I think they were trying their best to help a person who was in pain with what they had learned. They truly believed that they were trying to help me by prescribing this, that, and the other. So my goal now is to educate doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, to give them more knowledge. And I found a number of them to be very open to that, not all of them. But I didn't want to keep all of that anger in me. I wanted to do something about it. And I think that was important, to get rid of that, and not look at myself as a victim now, but look at myself as someone can empower others. And that's very important to me. The second thing is I have been surprised at how helpful retraining my limbic system has been. I've had the tools. I've been teaching them to others, but I didn't systematically follow a program for myself, that I needed somebody else to come in, give me bits of information. I needed a group to meet with that was celebrating small wins. I needed more than just doing it myself. Now, I know some people can do it all on their own, and that's great. Where I was, I needed the help. I feel incredibly grateful to the Facebook pages that I was on, where I got information about slowly titering off medication, where I got support. I feel helpful to Ben's program of Reorigin, that he created that and that I found it and that it's helping me, and the people that I've met there. So I'm trying to think about who have my helpers been, who have been there, rather than the mistakes and who I'm angry with. I'm trying to think of it more in a positive light. And I think that gives me a lot more joy.
Thanks, Kate. Ben, last few words.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I love, Gustav, your take on how we are kind of swimming in a sea of negativity, and almost like no fish is aware of the water in which it swims. We sometimes forget that, and when we then see things that are hopeful or positive, our brain, part of the limbic system, trying to make meaning of everything is like, nah, that can't be, that can't be the way. And there is a way. I shared a link to the study that you were, mentioning. Article came out in the Washington Post last year with the title "Chronic Pain is Surprisingly Treatable When Patients Focus on the Brain," and they showed 98% response rate to, I think it was a PRT, or pain reprocessing therapy type intervention, right? Neuroplasticity based intervention for chronic low back pain. 66% complete eradication of pain, and which lasted for longer than 1 year, as long as they monitored the participants. So there's a lot of really, really hopeful information. And again, to what Kay mentioned as well, one of the amazing things that we have, and our brain has the ability to do, is direct its own awareness and attention. And the more we can withdraw our attention from the things that are causing discomfort, whether scary news in the environment or unpleasant sensations, it doesn't mean we ignore or suppress them. It means that we realize that we have the option to invest our attention and our awareness elsewhere. That often puts those unpleasant feeling sensations in a much bigger context and gives our brain a much, I would say, more accurate picture of what's actually available to us in terms of how we can feel, what information we can use and pursue. And yeah, again, I know I really, like we all do, what it feels like to feel stuck and forgotten by the mainstream medical community, and all the frustrations that, some of which have been expressed here. I can certainly relate. I also know how capable we are as humans, and how apt our brain is to change itself. And I'm just so excited by continuing to have these kinds of conversations, to myself always learn more about neuroplasticity, and see these kind of success stories and everything. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's a process, right? That there's nothing that's going to come in and just flip a switch and that will be the end of it. And I actually think that's the way we want it, because when there is a process involved, it means that we can get involved. We can get at the helm of that process, and we can move ourselves from passenger to driver. So there's tremendous hope here, and yeah, this has been really exciting. And again, I thank you guys, Bob and Karina, especially for assembling this whole panel. Appreciate it.
Well, Gustav, Kay, and Ben, thank you so much for a great hour and a half. To the audience, there are so many great questions. I wish we had time to answer or raise these questions to you all. But thank you. I also want to do a little bit of a shout out to Karina. Karina has been organizing and arranging these webinars for Mad in America for more than 2 years. She was the one who thought of this wonderful webinar and organized and put it together. And Karina is going to be leaving us in the next few weeks. And we just want to say to Karina, best wishes and thank you for all you've done in making these webinars happen. So Karina, back to you, and you can close it out.
We also have a couple support groups at MIA. Zoe will drop the links for those in the chat. You can also sign up for our newsletter to see the next events that come, and Zoe will be organizing those. And then also you can follow us on social media. We post our events there, and we appreciate your donations because they help us run. And if you want to sign up for like $20 a year, you can come to all the events for free. And of course, we never turn anyone down for not having the finances. So we always offer a freebie code too, if you can't afford it. And with that, I will see you in the follow-up email. So thank you, everyone.
By the way, just so we have a next webinar on September 7th. It's with David Healy, and he's going to just sort of discuss this from a perspective of a nervous dysregulation syndrome, not a withdrawal syndrome. So it'll be great. That's on September 7th. So thank you all. Karina, thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
guys.
everyone for coming.